If US sees China as a major technological competitor, then a partnership with a country like India, which has significant tech human skilled capital, which is the only other country in the world with 1.4 billion people. So that partnership will be useful for the US in maintaining its global lead in innovation in many areas. And for example, there are more than 1,700 global capability centers in India.
Yeah.
60% of them belong to US companies.
You're on the gist on Stratnews Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan. Welcome to another edition of the gist. My guest today is Arun Singh, former Indian ambassador to the US. And we're going to talk to him about the US national security strategy that was released only last Friday. Ambassador Singh, welcome.
Thanks, Surya. Happy to be with you.
Chief, there's this NSS, as I mentioned, released last week. We had seen an NSS also during Trump's first term. And this one released without much fanfare and or noise. And in some quarters in the US, it seems to be discounted. What is your sense of this?
So, at one level, the national security strategy is important. It is mandated by the US Congress,
Yeah.
asking each administration early enough, uh, latest by the end of the first year, to lay out its broad strategy. So, every administration does it. So, from that perspective, certainly it has a limited shelf life because it
Yeah.
defines the approach of the administration then. And a subsequent administration can change that. So, the national security strategy in the Trump first administration was very different from what we see now. And in the
Yeah,
Biden
absolutely.
administration, certainly was again very different. So, that's one thing that you have to keep in mind. Secondly, it is not cast in stone. Because just because they brought out a national security strategy doesn't mean that when President Trump is taking a decision, he will look at the strategy and say, what is it said there? And therefore, I will decide on that basis. He will decide what he'll decide and let explanations evolve subsequently. And today he can take one decision, tomorrow he can reverse that. So this is
Yeah.
not his guide, but it is a way for the administration to distill whatever has happened so far and try and give it some shape, try and give it some harmony, some synchronization that this is our broad approach. Having said that, there are a lot of contradictions in what has been stated there. So yes, so they will use some of the formulation. I think where it helps is lower level staff who don't have access to day-to-day decision making in the White House or the National Security Council. They will look at this document in framing policy documents at their level. To that extent, it helps. And of course, allies, partners, adversaries of the US will look at it to try and understand what is the broad approach that the administration has. And there are, I think, several indicators of that.
Now, there are some key 2 points that have been made in this NSS. One, China is described as a near peer of the US. And there are also references to no more references to China, to Russia as a direct threat to the US. So let's begin with the China thing first. The fact that the Americas now say it's a near peer, meaning a competitor, and Trump, we've seen, has been on the back foot when it comes to levying tariffs on China. So, what is he trying to tell us about China? It remains a threat. It doesn't remain a threat. He wants to work with it. What's the generally?
So I would say China is one area where there has perhaps been some element of continuity, although there is change, some nuance, some element of continuity from Trump 1.2, the Biden administration, and even now. In Trump 1.0, eventually they had taken a very hard line on China. And they
Yeah.
had said that China is the country with the intent and capability to replace the US in the international system, is their main economic, technological, military rival. And not just China as a country or China as a state, but even the Chinese Communist Party. They had criticized very severely. And I think that the Chinese didn't like because that is the core of their governance structure. And they said that China has predatory economic policies. We need to deal with that. And without coming down ideologically in the same way on the Chinese Communist Party, the Biden administration had also defined China as a competitor and a challenge. Of course, they had said that we should not look at decoupling from China, but de risking from China. Have economic engagement, but have a small yard, high fence, so that the Chinese don't have access to the higher level technologies in the US. So, in this document, you're right, China is not quite described as a threat the same way, but still it is referred to as a rival, as a competitor. And there are several references to why the US needs to guard against the predatory economic policies of China and the excess capacity that Chinese have built up. It has criticized past administrations for allowing China to build up this capacity and looking the other way. Again, there are references to the challenge that China poses in the Indo-Pacific. And there again, there are references, direct or implied, to the challenges to keeping the sea lanes open in South China Sea. So again, if you see the reference to India, there are a couple of references to India,
Yeah.
but one of the references to India is very much in the context of the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah,
It says
absolutely.
that
Yeah.
US needs to build its commercial and other relationship with India so that India is able to contribute better to the security architecture and the security in the Indo-Pacific, and that also look at cooperation through the Quad framework. So I think they recognize China as a challenge. They specifically bring in, aside from South China Sea, the reference to Taiwan, and say that they would not support unilateral change in the status quo in Taiwan. So that again would be a message to China. So I would say that without getting into an ideological description of the nature of the Chinese government, I think there is a recognition of the economic and technological competition from China and the security challenges from China in the broader Indo-Pacific. So that's there in the document.
So basically, we're going to see a more muscular US assertion in the Indo-Pacific.
So that we have to watch. Because, for example, on China, the the current administration began by raising tariffs on China. And at
Yeah.
one level took it to about 100%. And the Chinese raised tariffs in a matching way, and that destabilized the bond market. So the US reduced the tariffs. After that, the Chinese have shown significant leverage by doing export controls on rare earths, on magnets, and the Americans have got into a discussion on them. And they've tried now to work out a trade agreement between them, try to negotiate a way so that US eases some of its own technology restrictions and the Chinese ease on export control restrictions. They want China to buy more farm produced soybeans from the US, which is a vital voting constituency for the Republicans. And they also want access in other areas to the Chinese market. So those discussions are continuing. So I think I would not say a muscular policy as such, but a continued recognition of China as an economic technological competitor, and based on that work out US policies. And I think, in terms of the muscular approach, and partly also linked to China, you see it in the Latin American continent,
Yeah.
in the South America, because there is a very clear reference to the Western Hemisphere as being an area which the US should dominate. In
Yeah.
fact, in the document, there is a reference to Trump corollary of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, if you
Yeah.
remember, the Monroe Doctrine was enunciated in 1815 as a
Yeah.
signal from the US to the European countries then, who were otherwise dominating the Western Hemisphere, that this is an area of vital US interest. They should keep away from there. Now, in this document, it says that this is an area of primary US interest. In this area, US will not allow an external or adversarial military presence, or having the external presence having control over major assets, strategic assets here. So there, I think the signal is that the US would be prepared to carry out a muscular approach in South America to keep Chinese influence away or to reduce Chinese influence. Because for large number of countries in South America, the largest trading partner in China. There
Yeah.
are heavy Chinese investments in many of these countries, including in infrastructure. China has a presence on many important ports in these areas. If you remember, right in the beginning of Trump 2.0, there was a reference of two Chinese entity or one Chinese entity having control over both the ports at either end of the Panama Canal, and
Yes.
US
Yes.
wanted to push them away. So I think the first muscular approach we should expect vis-a-vis China from the US would be in the framework of South America. And we'll have to see whether that plays out. Now, that will have consequences for countries in South America. They may not welcome that
Yeah.
because the
Yeah.
US will try to constrain their freedom of decision making. And in fact, in the document, it says that US will use other means to prevent governments in these regions from cultivating relationships with the adversarial countries. Now, what does that mean? Because in the past also there is a history of US having intervened in governments in South America,
Yeah.
brought about non-democratic changes, Chile, Argentina, and other places, to suit American interests. So I think that's an area we would need to watch. But beyond that, in terms of muscular, I would say that they would try to sustain the technology competition with China and try and minimize Chinese ability to push US away from the South China Sea, East China Sea, or the broader Indo-Pacific.
Let's come to Russia, where again we are seeing what appears to be a major departure from the past. Um, Even the Russians have welcomed it, the fact that they are no longer seen as a direct threat to the US. So, are we seeing here a major transformation in the US Russia relationship? We have had indications from Trump that he wants to get moving with Putin, especially on the Ukraine war and so on. Is this an assertion of that?
So, on Russia, clearly, as enunciated in the document, there is a major change from what we saw in the Biden administration or any kind of articulation earlier in the first Trump administration. But
Yeah.
right from the beginning in Trump 2.0, there has been a signal that they want to work out a resolution of the Russia Ukraine conflict to accommodate some or many of Russia's demands about how this conflict should be resolved. So I think it's very interesting that in this document, as you mentioned, Russia is not quite described as a threat. And what's happening in Europe at the Russia Ukraine conflict is seen not as something that is a challenge for the US, but is seen as something that the Europeans and the Russians have to resolve among them. Because in the Biden administration, if you remember, when the conflict started in February 2022, it was the Biden administration that was in the lead in trying to
Yeah.
mobilize opposition to what Russia was doing. It had leaked information about Russia's preparation, planning for that invasion at that time. But here, the argument is that the Europeans must get confidence to deal with the challenge in a different way. There should be strategic stability in Europe, reconstruction in Ukraine, and the US must work to bring about some resolution of this conflict between Russia and Europe. So it is being described as if it is a problem between Russia, the Europeans, and US as an outside mediator trying to resolve the issue between them. So certainly it's a major difference compared to what we saw in the Biden administration. And certainly in keeping with the line that Trump has been taking since his inauguration in January.
How could this be playing out with the intelligence, security, armed forces establishment that have been conditioned to see Russia in only one, in one lens?
So, are you talking of the establishment in the US
Yes, in the US.
well,
In
in
the
the
US.
US, establishment has been overturned significantly. You've seen all the major churning going on in the intelligence establishment, in the foreign policy establishment, and otherwise. And right now, it's President Trump who dictates policy. And he completely dominates the Republican Party. So there is very little opposition as of now, although some opposition is beginning to emerge on some of the policies, but largely very little effective opposition to what President Trump has decided to do. But it's not just in the establishment in the US. You are seeing the reaction in Europe. The
Yeah.
Europeans are shell shocked because not only is it that Europeans have to resolve this and that the US doesn't really have a dog in this fight, but more going on to say that the European civilization is under threat, that the patriotic parties in Europe are not being given space to
Yeah.
operate. There is freedom of expression is not being allowed in Europe, and the conflict is continuing. It is indicated based on sort of impractical assessments about the war by governments that are based on minority governance and therefore are insecure. So those are really direct criticisms of European policy making. So I think in Europe there'll be a huge churn about how do they interpret this. What does it mean for European security? Do they need to do more on their own? Can they do as individual countries unless they coalesce under some framework, such as the European Union? And in the document, there's direct criticism of the European Union, saying that it
Yeah.
is undermining the sovereignty of European countries. So, if you want to be Europe to be strong, to be able to handle its own security, and yet you want to criticize the structures that could unite Europe in some way. So, I think there is confused messaging there. But clearly, I think what's coming out right now is that the Trump administration would like to encourage the more right wing parties in Europe to come to power. And that was the message also that Vice President J.D. Vance has conveyed when he spoke at the Munich Security Forum in February,
Yeah.
which again had surprised the Europeans very much. So I think the policy enunciation related to Europe, European security issues are a major change from what we've seen in the Biden administration. And we'll have to see how that plays out.
Yeah. So now we come to New Delhi. How are we expected to react to this? I mean, you've been in the US, you've served there. How do you see it?
So clearly, the focus on India is much less than we saw in Trump 1.0 national security
Yeah.
strategy or the Biden national security strategy. Now, that doesn't mean that the focus will be less necessarily on the relationship, but in terms of the strategy documents. Also, in terms of the language use, both those documents were far more forthcoming in terms of describing the importance of the US India relationship, why it would be one of the very important relationships of the 21st century. India would have an important role to play in the Indo Pacific security structure. So, those things are missing. But that having been said, despite at the moment there being some challenges in the US India relationship because of the differences on trade, the 50% tariffs that President Trump has imposed in India, the references to India are still positive. And
Mm.
although they're in three or four places, is broadly on two counts. One, that they see still the relationship with India useful for the US in terms of dealing with the challenges in the Indo Pacific theater. And they've said that they'd like to build the relationship with India so that India can contribute more towards security in the Indo Pacific. So that's one. And also, as we discussed, a reference to the Quad partnership. The
Yeah.
second area where they brought in a reference is working with India in terms of rare earths and minerals exploitation, including in Africa. And that's the reference there to Africa, aside from trade and economic linkages. Now, if you recall, India is a part of the Mineral Security Partnership, which it had joined during the Biden administration. And the members are US and Canada, 8 countries in Europe, and then ROK, Japan, Australia, and India is a member. So I think, again, an important that in terms of supply chain security, US sees India as an important partner and wants to continue to work with India in the area of rare earths, minerals, and also explore partnerships with India in Africa in these areas. So that's the other signal that came across. I think what is missing, aside from the nature of the language use, is the fact that if US sees China as a major technological competitor, then a partnership with a country like India, which has significant tech human skilled capital, which is the only other country in the world with 1.4 billion people. So that partnership will be useful for the US in maintaining its global lead in innovation in many areas. And for example, there are more than 1,700 global capability centers in India.
Yeah.
60% of them belong to US companies, and they are doing cutting edge R&D and technology development work for the global operations these companies, recognizing that some of the technology development work being done here is useful for their own innovation. So that dimension is certainly missing. So I would say that yes, despite the challenges, no negative reference to India, but it's a subdued reference. And two clearly areas identified where the Trump administration, as of now, sees the relationship useful: Indo-Pacific, critical minerals. So we need to log that in and see how to leverage that for our own interests.
Assuming the trade deal is done, say by the year end, then all this, of course, gets a fillip.
Certainly. I know, despite the trade deal being done, a lot of things are happening. So, as I see it, while this difference persists and it has introduced certain amount of negativity in the relationship, including in public perception, public articulation, both sides have made a determined effort to keep the relationship stabilized as much as they
Yeah.
could. All other areas of cooperation have continued. So recently, for example, our Raksha Mantri met the US Secretary of War, the margins of an ASEAN meeting, and they signed the 10-year defense framework agreement,
Yeah.
which is the third iteration and much more forward-looking than the earlier ones. Some of the defense items also that India wanted to buy from the US, which are useful for US, including as we found in the context of Ops and Dur, and again backfilling what we've used. So there again, India has continued with the purchases that it wanted to do with the US, and US is also releasing those purchases. And right now, if you saw after the visit of President Putin to India, which I'm sure many in the West and including in the US would have watched with some adversarial gaze. Soon after that visit, the US Undersecretary of State for Policy, Alison Hooker, is in India for discussions.
Yeah.
And the US Deputy USTR is in India for continuing the trade discussions. So I think the discussions have been sustained. So I think there is an attempt to try and get past this challenge, resolve the pending issues on trade. And as you rightly said, Surya, once that is done, then some of the negativity will start going away. We move faster. But still, I would say that 2 points we have to remember. Through this action that the US took, there's a revival in India of the perception that US can be a coercive and unreliable partner. Now, keeping that in mind, once we are behind the challenge on trade, I'm sure the argument would be that yes, you must deepen the partnership with the US. Is the largest economy globally, largest consumer market, still the most powerful country. But even as you deepen, hedge more, diversify more, so that the US power to be coercive is less. So that's one dimension. Second, if you see, why are the Europeans so shell shocked today? Why did Europe, Japan, and ROK completely cave into US demands on trade? Because they
Yeah.
are security dependent on the US through NATO, through their alliances. So even as India buys more from the US or does defense technology partnership with the US, we must not become security dependent on the US. That any challenge we face, we should then have the capacity based on our strength to deal with that security challenge. So I think these would be the two arguments that would be important and I think valid. Keeping those in mind, I think again we can try and keep the pace or hasten the pace of consolidating the US-India partnership.
You've also mentioned the defense technology thing that has been going on between us. We also have a technology thing going on with the Trump administration. What has come out of that? I mean, the sense I get is that nothing much has really been transferred, or there have been a lot of discussions, yes, but nothing really has materialized.
I think you're right, Surya. Again, I'm not au fait with all the discussions that may be happening at the level of the government, but from what we are seeing from the outside, clearly that has slowed down in the Trump administration. And I think there are two reasons. One, of course, some of the difficulties that have been introduced by the tariffs that US has put. But more than that, earlier in the Biden administration, the initiative on critical and emerging technologies had made significant progress because it was run by the US National Security Advisor. and he was able to override the objections of different government departments and say that the US wants to do it, US president wants to do it, let us move with this area partnership. And we saw investments in semiconductors coming into India, G414 80% technology transfer being authorized.
Yeah.
Now in the current Trump administration, from all reports, the US National Security Council structure is a very denuded structure. And they don't really have mechanisms right now to pursue technology partnerships with other countries, including India, in any meaningful way. So I think that's one of the challenges why we are not seeing the real progress, perhaps, in some of these areas. But at the same time, if you recall, when the Prime Minister had gone to the US in February, in the joint statement that was issued, the initiative on critical and emerging partnership was not done away with. It
Yeah.
was said that it would be continued, although it was rebranded now as trust, transforming the relationship utilizing strategic technology, because I think the Trump administration did not want to give credit to the Biden administration. But okay, rebranding is okay as long as you do the actual cooperation.
Yeah.
But I think that's clearly an area where we are waiting to see more concrete results.
The last question. We keep getting reading statements in the press that the trade deal is in the offing, something is going to happen. Nothing happens really. And how long does one wait? I mean, we have a European FTA which could be signed, end of the year, early next. Does Trump want to wait until then, or what is holding it back?
I think what's holding it back, as I would judge from outside, so that you have to keep in mind,
Yeah.
not from any government level insight, is that if you saw the other trade deals that Trump has done with Vietnam and Indonesia, he projected that Vietnam and Indonesia completely opened up their market to the US. And US did not give any concessions, and yet he placed 20% tariffs.
Yeah.
Japan said, open up the market, we will invest $550 billion in the US. And the Trump administration said that this is now US sovereign wealth fund. Trump will decide where it will be invested. After a while, 90% of profits will go to the US, only 10% will go to Japan. Similarly, the Europeans said, we will invest $600 billion in the US and buy $750 billion worth of energy. And the South Koreans said, we will invest $350 billion in the US. Now, of course, the South Koreans said that, we don't have that money. But so he was able to show that he was getting unilateral concessions. I think that level of unilateral concessions he's probably not finding in this. So he's looking at some political peg on which to say that, okay, I got a great trade deal and I got more from India than any other administration could have done in the past. So let's see how they play it, because as you know, perhaps the trade discussion between India and the US have been more detailed than the discussions that the US has had with any other country. And from all that has come out in the public domain, it would seem that India has been much more forward-leaning in this trade discussion than with any other country. With the UK, we've done an FTA. With the EU, we are trying to finalize an FTA. So we should continue with that. We do as many partners. And again, exports to the US came down because of the
Yep.
tariffs. But from all reports, exports to many other countries went up. So I think US also needs to understand that there's a limit to the coercive power that they can exercise vis-a-vis India, including on the trade and economic front. So I think at some
Basically,
stage
about
it
face.
will happen. So we
It's
have to
basically about
just
face. Trump trying to save face.
find something that enables him to claim a major victory. So,
Okay, Arun Singh, on that note, we'll wind up this conversation. Good perspective as always from you. Thank you very much.
thank you.
That's all we have for you in this broadcast. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media. Thank you.